Hello, I'm Jim Miller, and I'm here with special guest Brian Poffenberger. The Flip Side starts right now. Welcome to the show. We're happy to have with us tonight Brian Poffenberger. Brian is president of Gruber Latimer Restoration. Brian, welcome.
Thank you, Jim.
Glad to have you here.
Good to be here. Thank you.
So, the first thing I got to ask, just from your perspective, talk to me about what made you excited about historic architecture. Is that what you went to school for? Is that
sort of in a way? When my first job out of college was in sales, and after a while, I was thinking, this is it. This is all I have to look forward to. So I went back and read an old copy of What Color's Your Parachute to figure out what I really liked. And it turns out I liked old buildings. I grew up on a farm. We were always doing something, jacking up the corner of something, and grew up in rural Virginia. And so I took that, figured out what I might be able to do with it, and got a master's degree in architectural history, historic preservation. And that was the beginning. So from my 20s on, this has been either an avocation or a vocation.
So, and you're historically, I know you had other jobs, and you had some corporate jobs,
Yep.
and you were the lead of our local Chamber of Commerce for many years, and then the State Chamber of Commerce. So this is kind of getting back to your roots. Is that?
It is, and it's a great, it's an exciting opportunity. I will say that when I got the degree in preservation and historic preservation, I couldn't buy a job. I tried. I really tried, and a couple times in my career I tried. And I pretty much said, okay, this is going to be an avocation. I live in an 18th century house in Sharpsburg. I put most of it back together myself. It was just something I did sort of, instead of playing golf or whatever. And then this great opportunity came my way. You may know Jack Latimer, and then before him, Dick Gruber, shepherded this company, which is now over 50 years old. And the opportunity came up to buy the company, and I'm now doing in my 50s what I wanted to do in my 20s.
Excellent.
Who can say that?
And the reason I bring up your history particularly is because I think that your service at the Chamber, your service in corporate America, your service at the State Chamber really gives you a unique position to talk about how the historic architecture can impact a community from an economic development perspective, from the perspective of what should we do to maintain it, should we maintain it. So let's get into that. First of all, from a definition standpoint, what do we classify as historic? Where does that line get drawn between historic and old versus new?
Right. So there are lots of answers to that question. The easy answer for a long time was anything over 50 years old sort of falls in that category. But if you drill down a little bit and you talk about what sort of why, it's more of a why thing, and the why is it divides into a couple of categories. One is, does a structure or a landscape have a connection to an important event or person? So did George Washington sleep here? And that makes it historic, and I'm going to use that as a broad definition. Another way to say it is it important? Is it a contributor to this overall conversation?
But that could theoretically make a shack important that has no other architectural interest.
Yes, that's correct. So if
probably has.
And so if George Washington slept in a shack, that counts, if you will.
Okay.
Is it related to something that something or some person that happened in the past that really makes it important? So that's one category. Another category, sort of on the opposite end, is it a great example of what it is? Is it particularly good at defining what Art Deco is, or colonial architecture, or federal architecture? Does it have elements that really make it a textbook example? Another example, so that's another category. A third category is, has it yielded, or might it in the future yield, important information? The obvious example around here are battlefields. It is important to maintain battlefields and preserve battlefields, not only to honor what happened there, but there's a lot of history in that space. And so it just makes sense to set those aside and call them historic. So you can see that there are different categories, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
that sort of roll up to the why. Why is it important? Why do we pause and give it a standing that we're calling historic?
Okay. From an architecture perspective, if we were looking not at the shack that George Washington slept in, but
Right.
if we're looking at architecture, what type of structures, what type of properties can be classified as architecturally relevant from a historic basis?
Well, part of my answer is the answer I just gave. So there's sort of up and down the line. In Washington County and Western Maryland generally, we don't necessarily have a Monticello or a Mount Vernon or a state capitol or a place that would resonate sort of unto itself. It's really the tapestry, the mosaic that the architecture. Drive down West Washington Street, and you see examples from all different periods, all different times, and you can make an argument, and I as we go on, I have other examples. You can make an argument that not any one individual building is important unto itself, though some may be. On West Washington Street, I can think of a few. Some may be, but it's the collective. It's the all of those buildings contributing to a streetscape. So we are really a city of Hagerstown is really a city of streetscapes that are architecturally important.
I have heard others that have come into our community, new to our community, comment on the architecture, comment on the
Right.
fact that they think we have some beautiful architecture.
Right.
Now, not all of those buildings are in great shape at this point.
Right.
They need some work.
Right.
What's your thought process on that? Would you agree with that? And
Well, let me take both of the points you just made. Yes, I think people that are just driving through, they come to the Stube for a good meal, and they find themselves doing the sort of one-way streets up and back. What they're really commenting on is that streetscape idea. Is that this is an intact, architecturally important space, the downtown. But then to the point about, okay, what do you do with buildings that aren't necessarily in great shape? I am an enormous fan of adaptive reuse. It simply won't work to view each building as a precious as a artifact from the past and preserve it in amber. Try to make a museum out of it. Those days have gone past us. People just aren't going to line up to see where the colonel slept and where the colonel ate and where the colonel whatever. Those days are gone. And so I think what we have to do is look at this streetscape, but look at it through a 21st century lens and say, how can we use it? We know how the people in 1840 used it, or we can certainly learn that. But how can we use it? And this may be where my chamber experience and my corporate experience sort of overlays. Figure out how we can take those same buildings, those same assets, and make them relevant in an economic sense. No one is going to be no one's going to revive the buggy whip factory, right? Because that's yesterday. What do today and tomorrow need, and how can we fit it in those buildings?
from an economic standpoint, if you look at tearing down a building and building a new one versus restoring, I'm sure that it runs a gamut. In some cases, it may be more palatable to do it one way or the other.
Right.
But do you, from your experience in getting into your current company, are there elements where you see that that it makes sense, that it makes a lot of sense to restore these buildings?
I'm a purist, so you're that question. I have my thumb on the scale
Okay.
to answer that question.
That's fair.
To me, all buildings can make a contribution. I mean, you as a building have to be in pretty rough shape for me to say, hang it up.
Structurally not sound, probably.
Beyond structurally not sound, because I'm looking at whose hands built it. What are we preserving? Can we recapture? Yes, it goes. Yes, it goes. We had a client that had a smokehouse. In the 18th century, they called them meat houses, but it was what you and I would call a smokehouse, and it was beautiful. It was a little gem. It was almost like a little temple, and it was in ruins. It was totally in ruins, and his approach to it, he didn't want to smoke any meat. he didn't have a side of ham that he wanted to bring in. He was concerned that what was being lost was the craftsmanship, especially of the enslaved community that built this little temple, all of whom are anonymous. Nobody has the name of the designer or the builders. And you could say that right up and down the line. The Irish stonemasons that came over and built the canal, or worked on the canal, the Scots-Irish that brought their craftsmanship, the Germans that came over here and must have known how to build in stone over in Germany, because they certainly came over here and did the same thing. The English, I mean, all those that melting pot of influences are expressed in our buildings. So you have to be pretty far gone for me to throw in the towel.
Okay, all right. Let's look at.
Does that answer your whole question?
It does.
I'm not
it
sure.
does.
Yeah.
So let's look at a specific project.
Okay.
I understand you were involved in the Pangbourne Park project.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to us about that and the impact that has had and will have in your view.
Well, I hear from the city that they get compliments every day. So to be clear, Hetzer was the general contractor.
Right.
So they did the work that really they did all the general contracting work.
Right.
We were brought in for our stoneworking skills.
Okay.
And so
arguably a very critical part of that project.
Well, yes, and it's probably it's the part of the project that makes it onto the Christmas card.
Exactly.
The storm drains, God bless Hetzer, but the storm drains aren't going to be on the Christmas card. But we work. I bring that up because these projects, especially the big ones, are always a partnership. They are always a partnership and are a testament to how well crews work together as much as anything. All that's sort of behind the curtain. So the lake at Pangbourne was built during the Depression. It was a WPA project. And
WPA meaning?
Works Progress Administration. So it was part of FDR's New Deal to put people back to work. There was a lot of there was a lot of infrastructure projects that were some of them could be described as leaf raking, projects just to have projects. But this was an amenity that was being added to the park. And so what they did is exactly what we did. They dug a big hole and they put a seawall around it, not dissimilar to the seawall at City Park in front of the museum. So we have old pictures. It looks back then exactly like it does now. A stone wall all the way around, lovely pointed. And over the years, of course, elements being what they are, I hate to say benign neglect, deferred maintenance is probably a softer way to say that. It just didn't get the attention that maybe it could have. And
well, and they didn't have some of the construction technology that I'm sure we have today as well.
Well, they did. Those guys in the WPA, they did a pretty good job. I can't blame them. You're right. We used a slightly different technique than they did. The below the water line, it looks a little different for the fish, but they don't care. So it was a WPA project. It had seen its better, starting to get long in the tooth, and the city put. I'm not sure of the product's name. Gunite is the product that I've heard, but anyway, it's what you put on a swimming pool. It's a lightweight concrete, and they skim coated it to keep it intact. Again, deferred maintenance. This was an expedient. We came in, took all that out, took the stones, the ones that we could save, we piled up so we could use again. Hetzer poured basically a concrete curb all the way around the lake, and then we rebuilt the stone wall in place exactly like they would have done in the 1930s. And so if you go out there now, the lake is full of water, and it is, again, I hear from the city that they get compliments every day, and we're happy to make that contribution.
It's a beautiful park. Now, I know you weren't involved in the project, but the C&O Canal, some of the locks that have been restored and so forth, I'm assuming they would have used a similar process?
They would have. So stone masonry is a skill, it's a trade. Our top two masons have been at it for 30 years. We just had a guy retire last year who had been with the company 50 years.
Wow.
And so you can imagine the kind of expertise people like that bring to the job site. We were actually involved in this was before my time with Gruber Latimer, but we were involved with the big Slackwater project. That was 10, 11 years ago now.
At least,
But that was to repair a washed out section with a seawall and canal. So yes, we have been involved with the canal.
Okay, excellent. What other, as you look at your top 10 list of things that you would like to get your hands on to restore?
Oh, I was afraid you were going to ask me sort of, yeah, my top 10 list or my favorite. I don't know. I want to restore everything.
You want to restore?
As a company, we tend to focus on earlier. So I have a line in about 1830. 1830 is when the Industrial Revolution really came to the United States. So anything before that was truly handcrafted. Masonry has always been handcrafted, but everything was handcrafted. So you really see, I mean, from the hinges to the gates to just the doors, everything. And so my personal passion is the 18th century, early 19th century. And so as a company, we tend to, when the opportunities present themselves, go that way. It doesn't mean we don't go elsewhere. Again, 1930s WPA. But so when I drive by a stone building that is, again, long in the tooth, and seen better days, and it's clearly from that period, from the colonial period or from the federal period, I take notice. I take notice.
Excellent.
I slow down the car.
We're going to take notice and check in with some of our sponsors. We hope you'll stay with us. Brian and I will be back for another segment after this. Welcome back. Once again, we're here with Brian Poffenberger. Brian, talk to me about some of the specific styles of architecture we might encounter in Hagerstown and Washington County.
So we're sort of blessed in that you get them all.
Okay.
You can find here in Washington County buildings from the early to mid, certainly the mid 18th century, so 1750s, 60s, 70s.
So that's like, is that like Hager House era?
Hager House era, yes.
And also, I guess our newly found gem at 417.
Yes, and
North
well,
Jonathan?
and that has a couple different levels of history, because I understand that the beams, they dendrochronologied
Right.
the beams, which is boring a hole and counting
Right.
the rings, which is fascinating unto itself, and determined when the trees were felled. And I'm not sure if they've determined that it was then, if those logs were, if that was the first use for those logs.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that, because a lot of times, and in fact I was just, it was actually over in West Virginia, but I was just looking at a beam literally yesterday that had a cut in it that made no sense for the building it was in. It was a dovetail cut, but it didn't connect anything. So
Right.
Clearly, in 1830, when they built that part of that building, they were
Recycling.
They were reusing a beam. So yes, so we have everything from the mid 18th century up to clearly mid-century modern. You can drive around.
Now, what does that define? Tell me about what is mid-century modern?
So think, I don't know if you're familiar with the show Mad Men. The prop department sort of went wild in recreating the 1950s.
Okay.
So
that's what I thought you meant.
rectilinear.
I live in that house, by the way.
Well, good. So we could do this from your living room. So you have great examples that certainly span that entire span. The thing that's great about Washington County is, and this is true of anywhere, buildings define the space. And they define the space by using what is at hand. And by that I mean the materials. So you see a lot of fieldstone, where in Potomac, Maryland, or Georgetown, or over on the Eastern Shore, it would be brick. Here it's stone. They also use the craftsmanship of the people that know how to put that together, so that they're using local craftsmen. So you can drive around Washington County and see all these styles, but interpreted through or with a layer of Washington County laid over it, which I just find fascinating. So I want to take, I can march through the different styles and sort of do a 90-second version of the history of architecture, but the thing that I like to keep in mind when a style, it is never the case that someone says, okay, today we're building a federal building, but tomorrow we're going to transition to Greek Revival. It doesn't happen that way. It's they blur, all the lines blur, and so what makes them blur are is again going back to this idea of what's around it. So, point one, the style in architecture is influenced by the same things and has the same outcome as all other different kinds of art. So think of A Dark and Stormy Night, the sort of the Victorian novel with The Dark and Stormy Night, and then think of the House from the Addams Family. Those are the same things. They're influenced by the same, whatever it is in society or whatever. They're the same thing. I wish I had brought some specific examples, but you can look at modern art and then look at fabric and commercial packaging even, and architecture, and see that there's this unity of design. So you have that. Design is also influenced enormously by technology. So think heating, think air conditioning, think lighting. All of those affect what you're doing. An open floor plan would have absolutely not been possible if the only thing you had were fireplaces, even stoves. Not until the end of the 19th century, and I think everybody's grandmother had a big grate in the middle of the floor. In the middle of the floor,
exactly.
Right. That heated the whole house.
Right.
And not until that technology came along could you have opened up and taken out partition walls and whatnot, because until then it was it was as close to the fire as you could get.
Right.
Interestingly, my grandmother's house, which had the big grate in the floor, was built in the latter third of the 19th century, and it had no fireplace. And the history of the fireplace is fascinating because, of course, we had them for 15,000 years. And then in 1880 or whenever we got to a point where people could generally afford central heat, they went away. And then a generation later, by 1920, they were back, but they were back because they were romantic.
Right.
And I don't mean romantic in the dating sense. It was a hearkening back. It was a nostalgia. It was a nostalgia design. Candles have exactly the same history. Everybody had a box full of candles until the light bulb, and then nobody had candles, and then suddenly a candlelit dinner was was all that and then some.
Right.
So all of these things stirred together are what make and I shouldn't skip over how people use the space as well. I mean, that's critically important. I have a friend down in Virginia who learned that her house, which was built in the same period, sort of 1880, was an early guest house. It was when people first started getting out and having recreational sort of weekends away kind of thing. And this woman opened the then current owner in the 1880s opened it wasn't a boarding house, it was a motel.
Bed and breakfast.
Bed and breakfast, exactly.
Yeah.
It was an Airbnb.
Right.
And the parlor was where all the guests sat around after dinner and told stories and swapped yarns and had dessert and everything. And that's part of the house's history. That's how the house was used. So you stir all those things together, and that's what really gives you the history of architecture. Again, we could march through. So you have the colonial period, which was followed by the federal period. The early republic. That was followed by the Greek revival. Very close use of classicism and columns, and Gone with the Wind is Greek revival, and then that spills into all the other revivals where you have Italianate towers and you have castles and you have provincial French villas all next to one another, sort of on the same street. That goes on for much of the 19th century. After which there was a colonial revival, especially after the centennial of the country in 1876. People got all excited about colonial history, and everybody built a wood frame colonial house.
Right.
And that lasted until you still have that, but that lasted until the middle of the 20th century when people started building things more out of glass and steel, and those who could afford it would go very what we would call modern. And this is the mid-century model.
So what I think I heard you say there, or the undertone there, is that in these early styles of architecture, not only could you understand what the craftsmanship was like, but also how the people lived, based on the way the house was put together.
Absolutely.
That is something I've never considered.
Yeah.
Now, how does that? Do you feel like that is still the case as we move out of that early period and post-industrial revolution that you were describing?
Less so, but I restored the house that I live in Sharpsburg in the early 90s, and I have 4 phone lines and two that were going to be dedicated to fax lines.
Yeah.
Yeah, how about that?
Fax lines.
Yeah. So it is also interesting, and this is one of those things you don't think about until you think about it. Rooms that are, the more specific a room is to the function, the sooner it looks and is out of date. So if you have a dining room that's just a big cube or a big rectangle, and there's no shelving, it's just a big elegant room. Mm-hmm. That room is timeless. That can be the kids' playroom, that can be the TV room, that can be the man cave, it can be anything. But a bathroom or a kitchen where almost everything in there is it's almost a date stamp. You can walk into a kitchen and within a decade, whether it's worn out. So it's just an interesting fact that my fax lines are obsolete, but obsolescence is a function of the specificity with which you design.
So you're a proponent of designing kind of just big empty rooms? Is that what I'm hearing?
Oh, I don't know that. I'm no designer. My goodness, I can't claim that. I appreciate those big empty rooms because they really are timeless.
So my mid-century modernist, I think the term you used. One of the things I noticed about that, number one, and you mentioned about the heating, which I can completely understand because my heating is boiler, right? Mm-hmm. And at the time, they were putting the radiators into the wall with a big white panel over top of them, effectively eliminating any possible use for that wall.
Right.
And then there's like 14 doors. I've got a bathroom that's about the size of this table that's got 3 entryways into it, plus a closet inside. And I guess that was a style, or
that really speaks to how that house was used.
Okay.
That's what I will say. I think that what happened in the latter half of the 20th century, from a design point of view, is and we haven't talked much about this, but design is a geographic signature. If you're in Frederick or Hagerstown or York or Lancaster, mm-hmm.
They
all have the same sort of Germanic feel. There's a feel. You go to Chicago or you go to a suburb of Chicago, even DC, you go to DC, even Baltimore, it's a completely different feel.
Yes, it is.
There's a little of that dividing the river. Again, I live in South County, between South County and the Panhandle of West Virginia, because the Eastern Panhandle, of course, was once Virginia, and it's the last remnant of the tidewater migration up from the sort of the Chesapeake area, but stopped by the river. And then on the other side of the river, we're sort of the last point at which Germans migrated. And so we're only 5 miles apart, but Shepherdstown and Sharpsburg look very different.
Yeah, they do.
They just feel different. So I think what has happened in the latter half of the 20th century and then the beginning of the 21st century is people mix and match as they, you'll see a New England salt box next to a Spanish-style villa next to a white clapboard colonial on the same street. That wasn't so common, with the big exception of the revival styles of the 19th century. That wasn't so common before 1950. You could come into a community and say, "Oh, I see what's going on. This is the signature."
So within the municipalities in Washington County and within maybe some of the developments, some being older, some being newer, do you see those transitions taking place as additional communities come on? You had mentioned earlier that you don't have one style today and then tomorrow say, I'm just going to do this style. Yeah. But do you see any of that as communities have been added in our
I'm probably
county?
Not a great architecture critic, and I don't mean critic in a critical way. I just mean commenter. I'm probably not the best commenter. I don't see the insides of modern houses.
Yeah.
And again, my focus is 1830.
Yeah. You don't care to, right?
Well, I don't.
No,
nothing.
I
mean,
No disrespect.
No absolutely no disrespect. But I'm a historic preservationist, and
Right.
I'm about taking those remnants from the past and making them viable, first structurally sound, but making them viable and putting them back into service, whatever that word means.
Yeah. Are there some examples in Washington County of buildings or structures that would meet the criteria or some of the design, the
Sure.
architectures? And what are they? Where are they?
Well, so if you think about one that's not quite in Washington County, but almost, and this is the shack George Washington slept in. Okay. Going back to our comment earlier. So if you drive across the bridge, the Route 11 bridge, out of Williamsport into Berkeley County, as
Okay.
your front wheels get to West Virginia, but your back wheels are still on the bridge, look to your right,
Okay.
and there's a big farmhouse with a little addition that's not in great shape. And the little addition is actually the original part. The addition is the mid-19th century farmhouse. The little addition was the I don't know exactly what the term would have been, the gatekeeper, the toll master, whatever.
Right.
It was the guy that collected the tolls. I guess the ferry master. There was a ferry before the bridge was there.
Right.
That's what that building was, and that little what looks like what reads as an addition. And it's older than it's old. And George was definitely there. He was all over this part of Maryland and then Virginia down into Winchester when he was a young man.
Okay. Wow.
So
I
so
will look for that.
So that's one.
Okay.
The Burnside Bridge is an example of and the battlefield generally, but the Burnside Bridge is an example of a structure that has. It relates specifically to an event, a time, a thing that happened. So that has its own it's in its own category. But there were 30 of those bridges built, 30 of those stone arch bridges built in Washington County.
Really?
And I don't know how many are left. 24 of them are left. I mean, it's a lot, more than you think
Really?
are left. And
I wouldn't
yeah,
even think where you could find 24. I know of 2.
let's go for a drive. I'll show you some bridges. Gruber Latimer has built sort of a cottage industry putting those stone bridges back together. The state, and I guess there's probably federal money involved, has been, and so certainly the county has taken a leadership role in this, has dedicated resources to fixing those bridges in this sense. It's not that they're broken exactly, but they're still in the traffic grid, if you will, of the county. They're still
Right.
being used. The only way, this goes back to my point about you can't preserve something in amber and expect to have it be viable. The only way to keep those bridges maintained is to keep them in the grid. If you go down 50 yards and build a modern bridge and think the stone bridge is going to have any relevance, sadly it's not. And it won't make sense for anyone to dedicate resources. So you rebuild that bridge, but you rebuild it to modern standards.
So would that be the case? The one I'm thinking about is on Route 40 headed towards Clear Spring. There's a stone bridge down.
That's Wilson Bridge.
Yep,
Yes,
yep.
that is an example. Though that's the example of where they went and built the modern bridge 50 yards away.
And
yes.
But luckily we still have the Wilson
Yes,
Bridge.
and I think that must be a park. I should know.
Yeah,
I
it
should know
is.
that, and people can picnic there. But there's another example going up towards on the Searfoss Pike, going between Searfoss and Mercersburg.
Okay.
You really have to know it's there, but you look down and there's a bridge and the trees growing out of it, and that's what would happen to most of them. We just finished with building systems. That was the general contractor on this job. The Poffenberger Road Bridge, if you can picture where there are two little bridges. We rebuilt those. We rebuilt the one in Funkstown. We rebuilt the one at Garris Shop. I mean, the list goes on. We've done 6 or 8 of these now.
Wow.
So we've done a little, and the county one at a time is rebuilding them. So, all they had to, when they were built in 1840, all they had to handle were, wagon loads
horses.
of hay and horse hooves.
Yeah.
And now, of course, they have to deal with a lot more stress.
Yeah, absolutely.
I did jot down 1 or 2 other examples. If you want to move on.
No, go right ahead.
I drive, because I drive north and south a lot, I drive up Locust Street in Hagerstown.
Yeah.
Locust Street has some nice houses, but most of those houses are modest late 19th century row houses. And that's a great example of that street is intact with a couple of holes, just a couple. That street is intact.
It is.
And if you start taking those away, the first one that goes, the second one that goes, no one's gonna make a big stink, because unto themselves, they're not necessarily of any historic note. It's collectively that a street like Locust Street, and you could say that about so many streets, every main street of every little town in the county, be it Clear Spring or Sharpsburg or Keedysville, it's the same thing. It's not that there's necessarily any great houses, though there are some great houses. I don't mean to diminish that.
No, I understand.
What makes them special and what gives them a sense of place is the streetscape in aggregate.
Interesting. Can you?
One
go
more.
ahead.
Sorry, the Nicodemus House.
The Nicodemus House.
Or Nicodemus Building on West Washington Street.
The current Discovery Station.
No, that was the Nicodemus Bank. Yes, one block up on the other side of the street, across from the church. On what is that? That must be Prospect.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
The one they're redoing. I think for there was an article in the paper just a week or two ago that there's some investors that are rehabbing that for student housing for the university, I think.
Okay.
That is a great example of what it is. That building deserves to be saved just because it is such a good example of what it is. It's a Romanesque is the term. Romanesque revival is the term for that.
Let me throw a couple by you. What about the Women's Club?
Lovely.
What is the architecture style that you would assign to that, if there is one?
Early Federal.
Okay, Federal.
Yeah, Federal early. Maybe there's some Greek revival that, again, the lines blur a little bit, and there's an addition on the back that I don't really. I mean, it was clearly once just a house that's been extended, and so I don't know about the extensions, but.
What about the lock tenders' houses at the canal? I know there's one in Williamsport,
right,
and elsewhere.
That is a great example of adaptive reuse. What they're doing with those, and maybe you weren't prompting me to say that. I don't know, but so style-wise, vernacular, just vernacular, everyday, working class, because that's what they were. They were lock tenders.
Lock tenders.
Yeah, they came out and
all
fed
hours
the
of the day and night,
exactly.
And opened the gate and shut the gate.
Right. What the so the C&O Canal Trust, which is the private nonprofit that runs alongside the Park Service and does some things that the Park Service simply can't do, has struck a deal where they have rehabbed some of those lock houses, and they've done them in different period styles. So you can go and stay in the 1820 lock house, but you can also go and stay in the 1950 lock house, even though by 1950 the canal was defunct. I guess somebody was still living in the lock houses, which is a really fascinating study and experience of what those houses were. And of course, by making them relevant, you breathe new life into them. You literally keep a roof on them, and you keep the stones pointed, and you keep the plumbing up.
Excellent.
You don't keep the plumbing up in the 1841. You have to go out back.
So if you would, I'd like you to stay around for one more segment.
Sure, happy to do that.
We will be back with Brian Poffenberger after these messages. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're again pleased to be with Brian Poffenberger, president of Gruber Latimer Restoration. Brian, let's get into a couple other things. First of all, let's talk about preservation. Let's talk about how we should be preserving, how we have preserved these historic buildings, this architecture that is such a big part of our communities locally.
Well, not to keep beating the same drum, though I will, because I think it's the answer. It's finding ways to make the buildings relevant, and so that is like any other operation. You really need a plan. You need a strategy. Adaptive reuse. There is nothing better for a building than to have a business in it. If there's a viable business in a building, that business will take care of the building. It'll keep it moving. It'll keep the roof on, keep the windows tight. There are a couple of tools that people can bring to bear, and I know them more at the state and federal level than I do at the local level. So I can't. I mean, they're experts in the city and the county that can help folks. But I did actually, before I go there, I wanted to go back to something you said. I don't remember the connection, but one thing in modern construction, one thing that is the hot topic right now is efficiency, sustainability, the greenness,
yeah.
the greenness of the building.
Right.
And there are certifications that whatever. There is no building greener than a building that's already there. So if that is a priority, then that, and it might be an externality. It might be hard to quantify, but if it's a priority to be green, considering using the infrastructure and the building fabric that's already there should be part of the conversation. It just should be.
Else that ends up in the landfill.
Else that ends up in the landfill, and all the effort and carbon created to get it there.
Right.
Yes. Right. But beyond that sort of strategic thinking, there are some very concrete, down-to-earth things that we're fortunate that the state has stepped in and seen its way clear to putting together historic preservation tax credits. Now, as with everything, the devil is in the details, and we don't have to get in the weeds on this right now, but the state offers I want to say this correctly, a 20% a tax credit equal to 20% of a capital cost. So you have an old building, you have to put a roof on it. The roof costs $50,000. The state will write you a check against your tax liability for $10,000.
Wow.
Now there's some paperwork.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. If it is a commercial structure, the federal government will do the same thing. So there's a state and a federal opportunity for commercial properties. So if you own a business, your building's probably bigger. So it's a $100,000 roof, but you get $40,000 back. That is public policy being brought to bear because this is seen as a good and a priority for local communities. So I would encourage anybody listening that if you have a historic home and you're thinking about doing really anything that costs real money, to look into historic preservation tax credits.
So at what point, at what year of construction would you have to be?
Yeah, that's the devil in the details and all that. So there are criteria. Really, the first question you asked me when we sat down, there are criteria that the state uses to determine the
Historic.
question. Historic.
Yeah.
Relevant.
Okay.
And they're
Okay. So you have to look into that.
You have to look into
research.
it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. The other question is, you mentioned about the building that literally has an outhouse. It doesn't have any plumbing indoors. How do we preserve the historic integrity of some of these structures while introducing some modern conveniences?
That's a tension that just is going to exist. I mean, you can the indoor plumbing is the obvious one, but you have your kitchen, you have your laundry room, you've got a lot of those 21st century things that nobody's going to live without. You have electricity, you have heat,
Yeah. Maybe even air conditioning.
Maybe even air conditioning. So there's always a tension between between absolute purity and what you can live with, and most folks agree that to keep the building relevant, you introduce these things. Often, there are certainly professionals out there, design professionals, that do this all the time and can be pretty respectful of the building's integrity.
Like when somebody introduced fax lines into
Like
there.
when somebody introduced fax lines. I thought I was brilliant. I thought I was building
at the time you were.
I thought I was building for the next 100 years.
At the time you were. Interesting. So on commercial properties,
Mm-hmm.
that becomes even more a challenge because the municipalities could have specific requirements if they're in a historic district of what needs to be done. I think the famous case locally is the wood windows in one or two of the properties downtown. Where are you on that argument? Should we have to have that level of detail? Should that be an option?
So, without regard to that specific case, because I don't want to relitigate that, there is that same tension between purity and doability. I'll leave it at that.
Or even utility.
Yeah, I mean, the start case is when you have a developer willing to pay something but not everything, and a bulldozer, and those are the only two choices.
Right.
What as the adjudicating body, where do you go with that? The purist would say, if you've ever been to Annapolis or Georgetown or downtown Richmond or Philadelphia, you don't know that you know this, but you know the value of some pretty strict historic preservation requirements. Those don't happen by accident. Those don't happen organically. Those happen because someone says we have some standards. They're usually pretty high, and the penalty for breaking the standards is pretty severe, and so people adhere. So that's the argument on one end. The argument on the other end is, do you want a vacant lot? Do you want a parking lot instead of a viable building? And so personally, and I've not seen this articulated, I can't articulate it that well, but I've not seen this articulated anywhere. I think there's room for discussion about levels, much like the LEED Green Building Council, gold, silver, bronze. I think there's room to have that conversation in the preservation community, where everything doesn't have to meet the same standard because it doesn't all start at the same place.
Okay. And would you agree that building a modern building as part of the Antietam battlefield is far different than modernizing a building that's downtown that otherwise might be torn down or left vacant? I'm not sure which is the worst of those two eventualities.
Right. And so there's a whole continuum. So one is be flexible with the integrity of the building that's downtown that's really severely compromised. So that's in play. Dare I say, and I'm a purist, so I don't advocate this, but sometimes that building can't be saved, but a sensitive infill can be built that respects the streetscape, doesn't take away from it, doesn't try to outshine it, doesn't introduce elements that don't really belong from a design point of view. And then back to the you mentioned Antietam and the inappropriateness of building a modern building there. If you think about the visitor center is as modern as 1960 could get us,
Yes.
or 1968. That's mid-century modern. And there is actually an argument to be made that if you're going to do something in amongst historic buildings, do something so no one gets confused. Don't try to fake it. Do something mid-century modern. I'm not sure the Park Service would do that again today, but that was certainly the thinking in the mid-1960s when they built that.
Interesting. Economic development. How can the architecture in our communities assist in the economic? Can that be a draw if we respect it, if we restore it, if people are making the investment? And I think we see investment, at least in the city of Hagerstown, and I think in Williamsport too. I think those are the two that come to mind immediately. The Hagerstown, obviously, with the Maryland Theater, with what Mr. Bowman is doing with several buildings down there and others. Williamsport, we see it's in a renaissance period at this point, a lot of investment there, a lot of buildings that say coming soon, which is great. How can architecture fuel economic investment and tourism?
So the Williamsport example is one of those examples of a modern building being fit nicely into a historic community and historic fabric. The National Park Service's headquarters of the canal they took the back part of the Miller Lumber Company, kept the front buildings of the old Miller Lumber Company, restoring them to their original. So that's a great example of infill with a modern building that works, and is spurring economic development in Williamsport. Boy, if I knew the answer to the question, the master question you've just asked, I would be doing more of these interviews, I guess. I will say this: the architecture of a place is who we are, and the idea that we can replace that, even if we knew how, it's no longer possible. But we don't know how. It's this 200 years of social conversation and technology and progress and tug of wars and tension. It's all encapsulated in the buildings. And so every time we take one down, we lose a little piece of that. Conversely, if we focus on those things, it's at the very least an expression of who we are as a community. So somebody coming in will see that, for better or for worse. That's what they'll see. They won't see a gleaming skyline, but they also won't see they won't see a community that doesn't understand the importance of itself. How to do that? The tools, though. Let's talk to the planning departments of the city and the county. Those are the professionals that really know the answer to those questions. But some of them, and I no longer spend much time in the public policy realm, but some of them include ideas like making historic preservation an overlay in the development and permitting process, just like we would traffic or utilities or schools or anything else. So it's not an exception that you have to appeal. It is part of the fabric. And then if that process sorts itself out and historic fabric has to be removed to move things forward, then it's been given a fair shot. It's
an informed decision.
And it's an informed decision. Everybody's had a seat at the table, or whatever metaphor we want to use. Again, nobody wants to do a taxidermy job on a community. It's not viable. It wouldn't work. There are no resources for it, but it wouldn't be real. It wouldn't be vibrant like cities should be.
Well, in the streetscape, to your point, and you didn't say it exactly this way, but I think your point, or part of your point, was that the streetscape defines the community.
Absolutely.
It talks about who we are, where we've been, where we're going,
Yep.
and that's an important piece.
Yep.
Interesting. Brian, thank you. This has been enlightening, to say the least.
Well, thank you, Jim.
And best of luck with your, I guess it's not a new company for you at this point, but Gruber Latimer Restorations. You specialize in masonry, is
Correct.
that
Historic
accurate?
masonry. That's right.
That's all the time we have tonight. We hope you will like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. We hope you will send us your comments and suggestions to feedback@theflipsidetv.com. That's feedback@theflipsidetv.com. Most importantly, we hope you'll join us again next week for another visit to the Flip Side. Good night.